This is the Apple Studio display, and after using it over the last year, I've developed a love-hate relationship with this monitor. On one hand, it's beautifully designed, integrates seamlessly with my Mac, and there really isn't anything else like it on the market, but on the other, it is starting to show its age in some pretty critical areas, especially when you look at the competition in 2025. Today, I'm breaking down what those areas or aspects are and going over everything that I've experienced over the last year, from the things that make it shine to the reasons I'm seriously considering moving on from it. So if you're considering buying the Studio display, you might want to stick around for this one. With that said, let's get into it. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. The Studio display is one of those products that seems to be somewhat polarizing. Some people absolutely love it, some people are on the opposite side of the spectrum, and I would say that I'm somewhere in between, where there are definitely things that I appreciate about it, but especially in 2025, I am starting to wonder at this point if I should move on and look at some other options. Monitors have come a long way since the Studio display came out in 2022. There are more 5K and 6K options, and outside of the resolution, the general specs on some of these panels are getting better and better. You've now got 4K OLED options with super high refresh rates, mini LED options, crazy brightness specs, and all kinds of features. But with that said, there are some things that still set the Studio display apart from everything else out there. One is the design and the overall build quality, with the Studio display having a full aluminum construction with a glass front panel that is silver in color, so no plastic in sight, which is extremely hard to find in a monitor. Everything on it looks quite minimal, from the simplistic stand and hinge, speaker grills on the top and bottom, and the 4 ports along the back. Even the provided Thunderbolt and power cable are made up of a nice braided material that complement the premium nature of the monitor. In terms of wear and tear, using this for the past year and a half or so, everything still looks just as good as the day that I bought it. The cables aren't frayed. I've been pretty careful not to tug on the power cable on the back, as that isn't removable, which I suppose is somewhat of a downside, but there are no scratches on the metal body or on the screen, even with it being moved around from desk to desk and packed around to different locations a few times. Likewise, the hinge is still smooth and hasn't loosened or worn down at all, and to my knowledge, there really isn't a monitor that matches the level of build quality here, outside of the new iMac, which I do think the Studio display could take some cues from if they do give it a refresh at some point soon. For starters, the iMac is a lot thinner at 11.5mm versus 19.5 on the Studio display, and at this point, it is kind of a chonker compared to other premium monitors these days that are super thin. I know you can make the argument that there's a lot that's packed inside this Studio display, like the chip, the webcam, and the speakers, but the iMac has all those things as well, and they're arguably better at almost half the thickness, which I'm gonna get into in a bit, but putting all that stuff aside for now, let's focus on the most important part of this product, which is gonna be the panel itself. I opted to go for a glossy finish on this panel over the nano texture option. Not really because it's cheaper, but I find it just looks a lot cleaner, and everything is a tad sharper over the matte finish of the nano texture. I've mentioned this many times on the channel before, but with nano texture, it puts somewhat of a rainbow or speckled RGB look over light content. Things can also look a bit fuzzy, and because there isn't a ton of sunlight where I have my display, it just made a lot more sense to go with a glossy finish. When it comes to the actual picture on this display, that's where you start to get mixed results, where you do get a 5K IPS LCD panel with a 218 pixel per inch density that does give you a nice crispy image, but it is limited to 60 Hz and has a relatively low response time, and it does lack some pretty standard monitor features like HDR and any kind of local dimming. Local dimming essentially gives your monitor the ability to adjust brightness levels in particular zones on your screen rather than having one constant brightness level. If you've got a MacBook Pro, that's what the Pro XDR display uses, and that can help with contrast and reducing things like light bleed, which I will say the studio display does suffer from quite a bit. If you look along the edges of the screen, on most of these panels you'll see some light peek through, causing uniformity issues, and it got so bad on this particular monitor that I actually brought mine into the Apple store and had them replace the panel under warranty. But even this new panel suffers from it. It's not the end of the world, and a lot of people might not even notice it, but if you are a pixel peeper or a monitor snob, it can be somewhat bothersome. Despite that, the color accuracy is fantastic on the studio display and is a big part of why I love using it, with it covering 99% of the P3 gamut. If you are doing any kind of color critical work, the image this gives off is pretty reliable color-wise, and visually, it matches up quite well with any other Apple device display, but the contrast, on the other hand, does leave a lot to be desired. Apple doesn't officially list the contrast ratio anywhere with the studio display, but I found it to be pretty disappointing, where testing this out over the years has produced a max contrast ratio of 1000:1 at 100% screen brightness, and drops down significantly to just over 500:1 at 50% brightness. For context, a good IPS display is usually above 1000:1, even at lower brightness levels, and the new iMac retains an 1100:1 contrast ratio between 50 and 100% brightness, and is much better in that regard. Lately, you're also seeing new options like the Dell UltraSharp 6K and the BenQ PD2730 listed at 2000:1. So it is really starting to fall short there, but I will say you do get a max brightness of just under 600 nits on the studio display, which does still beat most of these types of panels. I personally have never had this running at 100% brightness, so I'm not sure how much of a selling feature that is for me, but putting specs aside, I do think that this looks good and does the job just fine for everything that I do in my workflow. And even though some of those other panels perform better in terms of overall specs, the primary reason I've kept my studio display doesn't really have anything to do with that, but it's what you get by using a genuine Apple product. Like I said earlier, not only do you have the 5K panel and the great build quality, but you also get a set of 6 built-in speakers with spatial audio, an A13 chip that runs everything, 3 open USB-C ports, and a built-in webcam and mic. And the seamless use of all of these things, and the reduction in cables and clutter at your desk is really the ultimate selling feature for me. I only need the power cable connected and the provided Thunderbolt cable going to my Mac, and everything just works, and I don't have to worry about plugging in speaker cables or any compatibility issues. Sometimes on lesser known monitors, they don't have the right display profiles for Mac, and you can run into issues at times. And unlike using third-party displays, there's no monitor menus that I've got to dig through to adjust anything. Everything from brightness levels to volume is all adjusted on my keyboard, and it's just one of those things that you never really have to think about. As far as the sound goes, while the studio display does have spatial audio, it does not support Dolby Atmos, but macOS will process Atmos data and try and simulate it through the speakers, but regardless, it's pretty amazing given it's just built right into the display with a nice full sound, at least good enough for anything that I need. I usually edit these videos with headphones on, but normally I will play back the audio through the display to make sure things sound okay. I'll often have music playing in here while I work, which sounds great, and videos are the same story, where both watching content on the studio display itself or casting to the wall-mounted TV in my office sounds full, crisp, and clear. The built-in webcam and mic, I would say are okay quality, nothing to write home about. The picture is pretty soft and noisy, and the mic audio is average, but both are definitely nice to have and are good enough for calls. And as far as those back ports go, I honestly don't think that I've ever used them, but I suppose if you didn't have enough ports on your Mac and didn't have a USB hub, those may come in handy. The other great thing about this display that not a lot of people talk about has been the support, where as I mentioned, I did take this into the Apple Store, and they replaced the panel under warranty, no questions asked, and had it back to me in a couple days. And I just don't see any other company matching that. There have been times dealing with other manufacturers where I've had to fight tooth and nail over much bigger problems than that, and usually it's a long drawn out process where you've got to ship your product in and wait weeks to hear back. And I think the closest you're going to come to Apple support is probably buying some kind of aftermarket insurance through a retailer. That being said, there are getting to be some really compelling options coming out recently that are making me wonder if it might finally be worth switching. Both Asus and BenQ have new 5K options that on paper have better overall display specs. Asus also has a 6K display coming out that I do kind of have my eye on, and most high-end monitors these days are also color calibrated from the factory, and most, if not all of these options are going to be much lower in price than the Studio display, with it coming in at a base price of $1,599 USD. That can easily go up to $1,899 or $2,299 depending on the display finish and the stand you want. And for that price, I do think that you should be getting a much better overall picture included, because there are elements to this that are fairly subpar. The iMac, for instance, has better overall display specs and doesn't suffer from the same light bleed issues. The webcam is better, it sounds just as good in my opinion, and although it's only 24 inches, it shares the same pixel density and is packed with an M4 chip for $300 less than the Studio display. It's great to have good support and a monitor with fantastic build quality with all of these things built in that work so seamlessly with other Apple products, but I just think that the longer this goes without an update, the less it makes sense to choose this over something else. Personally, I have really enjoyed using this monitor. It's predictable, I know that the image is gonna look good, colors are still fantastic, but there's just so many good alternatives these days that if I had to choose now, I think I would lean towards something else. That being said, I would love to know what you think. If you've got a Studio display, let me know what your experience has been like, and if there's another monitor that you'd much prefer over the Studio display, drop a comment down below and let me know. That's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video or you found it useful. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related videos or help me program a Roomba to do interpretive dance on hardwood floors, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.